Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus is not a very good game, to say the least. While a sequel is supposed to improve on everything from the original, Wolfenstein 2 does its best to take anything you might have enjoyed from the previous title and destroys any semblance of plot, character, or importance that was established in New Order. But I'm getting ahead of myself, really, since there's a lot to talk about, and what better to talk about than the thing that is probably the worst aspect of this game, which is the story and the characters. Now, on paper, the story of BJ and friends having to team up with other resistance groups is actually a really good way to have a middle game in a trilogy play out, since it sets up the stakes for the finale most of the time quite well. Here, however, it just feels like it's trying to throw out each plot point as quick as it can so it can be over in time for when Youngblood comes out. I will say, bar the flashbacks and the foreshadowing of terrible humor, the first 30 or so minutes of the game are actually really enjoyable. You go around the U-boat as an injured BJ, hunting down Nazis in a wheelchair, and for a while, it feels like the New Order. Then Caroline dies, and that isn't even a spoiler, that was hyped up in the marketing for the game. Yep, Caroline dies in a horribly over-the-top sequence that tries to evoke an emotion from the player, but I just found the forceful act of trying to get me to hate the villain annoying, since we already established how vile and evil Frau Engel was in the previous game. Although this, like the bad jokes from Set, are just warming us up for the fact that the rest of the game is just going to be more unnecessary extremes from all sides. I really think that Caroline's death is a metaphor for the death of the game, personally. It drops off into terrible quality right after this. Now, with Caroline dead, BJ and gang must find a new way to put a stop to the Nazis' plans by liberating America, and to do so, they travel from set-piece location to set-piece location enlisting the aid of the Black Panthers, a conspiracy nut, and some drunk communists. With them, the game turns into what could have been a great action exploitation game that is reminiscent of 80s action films. What we got was an out-of-touch game that was more focused on trying to get critic brownie points than it was on telling a fulfilling story with good, likable characters. In the end, even with the pit stops of getting new factions, a lot of this just still feels like a rehash of the previous game's key plot points, such as BJ recovering and fighting his way after being injured, having someone who was once a Nazi join the heroes, and even having BJ go off planet to Venus this time around. The only major difference in plot points here is the drastically different ending tones and styles, but we will talk about that here in a bit. The most original and some of the more irritating parts of the story come in the form of completely pointless flashbacks to BJ's youth, which are solely there for showing the player how abusive and racist BJ's dad, Rip, was. Rip could have been an interesting character, who in the end turned out to be weak and pathetic due to his hatred and prejudices, or have them be his downfall since he cast others not like him away. But really, he is just shoehorned in to be a racist caricature, much like the rest of the cast. Speaking of horrible characters, when you visit Venus undercover as an actor to infiltrate a film audition, you run into Hitler, who is the producer of the film. This leads to some incredibly unfunny and gross out moments that just drag on forever. When it's BJ's turn to audition after almost all the other actors, including Ronald Reagan, have been killed, you have the chance to kill Hitler. You get punished for killing him. It doesn't even make sense. The kill is incredibly tame compared to all the rest of the in-game deaths, and you don't even play as BJ in the next game. So I honestly don't understand why they didn't just do a dual timeline like they did with Fergus and Wyatt. Have one where you choose to let him die due to his decrepit age and mental state, and another one where you cave his head in. Lost potential, the game could have at least thrown Mecha Hitler in for us to battle, but I suppose that's why a complete, albeit sprite-changed version of the original Wolfenstein 3D is here to play. Thankfully, the story and the game are over really quickly, taking only around 6 or so hours with deaths thrown in, with BJ axing Engel in the face. Instead of the ending with BJ giving the American people a hope-filled and patriotic speech like he did in the last game, it's unfortunately Grace and Horton taking the broadcast screen, screaming their own propaganda to the viewers at home. I think it's even funnier that instead of the last screen of the game being BJ and crew holding up an American flag or something else similar, it's only Grace giving off a fight the power fist, clearly showing this is not a team effort, even though BJ did almost all of the work. So yeah, the story outside of a few key moments is really bad, and it's made worse by the fact that there could have been a few genuinely great scenes added to the list of things I didn't hate if they weren't completely ruined by dick and fart jokes. No, seriously, for every serious scene, almost all of them end with someone going to the bathroom, farting, or mentioning some sort of gross out gag. I could have tolerated a subpar story if the characters were good, but they aren't outside of like 3 or so of them. They are all either irritating or just downright hateable. BJ Blazkowicz, our all-American hero, has been changed from someone who believes in the good of humanity in the American way to someone who can't even tell if an innocent man isn't a Nazi because of his skin color. I like the PTSD aspect of him missing Caroline and his mother, but it started to drag on as he kept repeating himself with similar sounding thoughts and prayers to them throughout the game. Anya is just there until the scene where she puts her twin babies in danger. Set is now a mad scientist who plays Frankenstein and constantly goes around saying random things like schmeckle in reference to BJ's penis. Caroline is one of the few characters not ruined, but she also escapes the butchering of character due to her early death, instead being replaced by Grace, regrettably. I played the Fergus timeline, and Fergus was fine for the most part, outside of the obnoxious Evil Dead robotic hand ripoff. Bombate starts off fine, but becomes a jerk later on, which I really didn't like. Max Haas is surprisingly one of the few characters that remains likable and isn't made too big of a joke, and even has a good character arc that I actually will not spoil since I legitimately enjoyed it. Then we have the new characters, with Grace just being a horrible bully to the cast, and Super Spesh, her paranoid conspiracy nut of a significant other who can't go a minute without referencing toilet humor or aliens. Horton was just a loudmouth who was fairly spot on to how he would have been in real life, and the only good inclusion to his introduction was the smooth Paris Jack, who was a calm, well-spoken resistance fighter. While I liked Paris Jack, he was sadly barely ever on screen, and the last character who was new to the present cast was Sigrun, who is one of the few actually likable and tolerable characters in the game. Oh, and I liked Shoshana, the weird cat-monkey hybrid that Set made. It was cute. BJ's mother in flashbacks is just a kind woman and not much more. While I like that she stood up for BJ against Rip, there isn't anything else that really happens with BJ's mom, since along with a young girl by the name of Billy from BJ's past, they are just used as an emotional tool trying to evoke sympathy from the player, more so than feeling like a real character. Outside the Nazi forces, you had Frau Engel returning as the main villain, who, like I said, was just not really all that fun with how silly her performance was. Rip, BJ's father, was also, like I said, an extremely one-note character, and outside of him yelling racial slurs every other minute, he was incredibly forgettable. His send-off wasn't even fitting for someone who was supposed to be that much of an impact on BJ's life. Also, while Rip was horrible, I found it odd that they included a relatively softer scene with him and BJ in the past. I could honestly go on all day about how the story and the characters were butchered, but this review isn't a video essay. You know what? For once, I'm actually going to be positive in the review. When you get to shoot stuff, for the most part, the gunplay is a lot of fun. I like the weapon lineup here, even if it felt a bit limited. Thankfully, with the weapon upgrade system, regardless of how sparse each of those upgrade kits were, it let weapons feel different with each upgrade you implemented on the gun. Shame some of the upgrades messed up the feel of the gun without the ability to remove them, like the fact that once you fully upgrade the heavy machine gun with the scope, you can no longer use the burst fire function. I liked how the weapons felt though, since they had a good sense of impact surprisingly. I really enjoyed the nail gun add-on to the submachine gun even if it was a bit slow, and the silenced magnum upgrades for the pistol made the pistol actually useful. Also, the shotgun is incredibly overpowered and probably one of the best weapons in the game, right alongside the laser rifle. They aren't the best guns in gaming ever, but for a game as subpar as this one, it's nice to at least have fun weapons to use. Shame ammo could be kinda hard to scavenge sometimes, with enemies only dropping a few bullets with each kill. I like the change up from the knife to the fire axe for melee attacks, as the animations were a lot more swift and violent, but once you got locked into a melee animation, you were totally open to being shot from all sides. Also, speaking of the gore, it's alright. It's nice to see enemies explode into red and BJ's arms and weapons get covered in gore for sure, but I wish there was more locational damage than the few times it happened with the axe. Halfway or so through the game, BJ gets executed and dies. Yep, our hero dies, but is brought back through the power of the longest 7 seconds ever as his severed head is put onto a synthetic super soldier body. This is really only introduced into the plot to give you one of 3 special abilities, even though you can collect the other 2 through side quests, which kinda kills any replay value value that there is. I chose the ram power since it allowed me to actually injure enemies and gain access to new areas easier. The other two being a pair of stilts that I found in my last playthrough made you a massive target and easier to knock down when you try to reach higher up places, and a corset that is almost completely useless in every sense of the word. I actually kind of forgot about this section while writing the review, but I remembered the fact that you rode around on a mecha dog with a flamethrower, and while the section was cool, it was over really quickly and just kind of forgotten about after that, which is a shame because it would have been cooler to use it on some other missions, but like a lot of other things in the game, was quickly shoved out of the way. There were a few collectibles, but outside the weapon parts and readable material, I had absolutely no clue what things like the black star cards or paint collectibles did. I figured they got me concept art, but when I played around in the menus, it just said which ones I collected and nothing else. Speaking of extra content, the idea of collecting the Enigma codes off fallen commanders to unlock side missions where you hunt down other commanders is cool in concept, but outside of one or two that use non-combat stages, they were just repurposed story maps and not well disguised at all either. Sadly, the enemy soldiers felt a bit spongy even when you upgraded your weapons, and this isn't just because they were wearing armor, as even when fighting scientists or engineers enemies, they still felt like they were taking more damage than they should. It doesn't help that you only start off with 50 health for around half the game, and even when you get your maxed out 100 health, you can still go down in a matter of moments. Yes, overcharging your health is still a thing, and I like that if you hit 200, it stayed at that until you're hit again, but it still didn't stop the fact that I felt like there were cheap kills due to how hard the enemy hit. The enemy variety was similar to last time, with some new foes added to what you will fight. The new fast robot troopers dodge your attacks, and while they went down fast enough when you actually could hit them, their streak effect and how fast they move made fighting them in groups a pain. Similarly, even though they are not new, the dogs are actually made much more frustrating this time around, being hard to see and knocking you down so enemies could get some deadly hits in. Also, if you hope to fight KKK members, they are locked to a side mission only, with a single joke in the main campaign featuring them in a non-combat environment. Environments are, Roswell, New Mexico was alright, mainly because it had a lot of color and stuff going on in it, but it sadly wasn't a combat level. The courthouse was another alright level in terms of color and design, but I also didn't like the whole swarm of enemies thing that was going on. Otherwise, this was definitely one of the better levels in the game. A lot of the levels just felt a bit disjointed, like they wouldn't really connect like they do most of the time in real life. They were serviceable, but generic would be a good word for them, since literally none of them stick out in my mind, and it was honestly a bit easy to get lost in them. On the graphics side of things, I'm really not sure how I feel about how this game looks. It technically doesn't look bad. The cutscenes sometimes look better than the in-game characters and locations, but other times they looked incredibly rough. It was just a very odd mishmash of range, graphically speaking. I was running the game at max settings, and it just didn't really give me that max settings feeling. The character models were just sort of ugly for the most part. They were textured well enough, sure, but none of them looked all that appealing, sort of like a crude mocking remake of how they should look. I also don't care much for a lot of the new outfits the characters were given, especially since I like BJ's bomber jacket a lot more than the attention-grabbing yellow jacket he gets later on. The game ran fairly well, keeping at a steady frame rate for most of the game, dipping down from 144 to around 80 or so here and there, and only once going back down to 60 for a brief moment. It's not a well-optimized game though, as the last times I tried it on my PC, it had graphical problems galore, and I have heard from others that your results may vary. I just had luck with this current PC build. Also, sadly, not having adaptive VSync on will indeed cause horrible screen tearing, so having that on is a must. It just means you might dip below 60 here and there for a moment if you don't have a refresh of 144 for your monitor. Also, there was this weird bug where everything jittered when I was in the interrogation room that thankfully fixed itself before the next scene. Also, I gotta mention the FOV, as I had it at around 120 for a good majority of this review run, but I later turned it down to only 100 because the animation started to break. I know the menus warn you not to mess with the FOV, but really, the FOV here is so messed up any way you play it, that really the only way to truly play the game is with a higher FOV, even if it does break some of the gameplay immersion. Everything sounded meh. The guns sounded underpowered, characters sounded whiny and both overly acted and underacted at the same time, and the music when it wasn't just generic rock playing in the background, was downright terrible. All you need to know is that the cover of Twisted Sister's "We Are Not Going to Take It" that they used at the end is one of the worst things I have heard in a while. And with all that said, I really don't think Wolfenstein 2 is worth anyone's time. Instead of trying to tell a compelling continuation of the story they had set up, Machine Games made an unlikable and mean-spirited experience that instead chose to alienate a good deal of its fan base and appeal to people who weren't even going to play the game. It shows as well with the fact that the game went on sale mere days after being released, and even with the price drop down to only $20, it's still too much for a story that is more cutscene than game. Filled with terribly written and downright nasty characters, a shallow story that could have tried more to be a fun B-movie, and gameplay most games do better, save your money, and get a better game. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider sharing the video with a friend or checking out the rest of my content on my channel. If you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon link down below. A huge thank you to the show's continuous patrons of Gemstar Gold and Project Nova. If you have any comments or recommendations or anything, please let me know as I read everything written down in the comments. Until next time, this is Thierry Williamson signing off until the next video. See you guys!